howdy, how y'all doing today? You know, when I asked for names to name that old man, I wasn't expecting this many, but there's a bunch of them. And what am I going to do? I'm going to call off the names and who sent it in, and then I'm going to put all these names and everything, the channels that suggested the names and all. I'm going to put all that down here in the info section. And what I want y'all to do is I want y'all to listen real close and look at the names and all, and vote. Just take the name and put it in there. And down in the comments section, just put it in there, and we're going to keep count and keep a tally on how many wants this name, how many wants that name, and one comes out on top, well, he comes out on top. And the people that sent these names in, if you want to get a lot of votes, send it out to your subscribers and your friends and ask them to come over and take a look and vote for them and whatever. Maybe we can get a little thing going here and more people will pick up on and meet more people. But anyway, let's get it started off. Sherry Wine, 1941, she said his name ought to be Stud Muffin Sr. BKC, 1965, said his name ought to be Mr. Bates. MEHQUIG, he said his name ought to be Lester Poindexter. Okay. Rebel Dog said his name ought to be Archy Boner. Okay. Jimmy Mac 30, been knowing Jimmy a long time. He said that his name ought to be Chester Titsy Tighterscrot. Okay. B. Meyer 44 said his name ought to be Roscoe Simpleton. Goth Gamer 0990 said his name ought to be Old Man Peewee. Catfish Carden was sent in by MrJoecarden. Ordinary 7 Sasha said his name ought to be Cameltoe Tommy. SYP Davis sent in, said his name ought to be Richard Samples or Dick Samples. Okay. dDayye sent in, said it ought to be Ollie Drake. Felix Foster, that was sent in by BAMAGOALPOST. I like that one, Felix Foster. Mr. Steve 07, I'm sorry, was sent in by Mr. What 15. BKC 1965 said his name ought to be Dick Bush. Sunset Lover, you gonna try to get me in trouble, ain't you? Sunset Lover said his name ought to be Charlie Bumblefuk. You didn't think I'd say it. There it is. Captain Franky Frightening McWibbleknees Jr., Senior Jr., was sent in by WeirdFTW. McWibbleknees. Cletus Boudrow Beauregard. That was sent in by my buddy Roy, Fat American Bastard 1. ARUKU sent in by Mume. Oh, Mr. Weebody was sent in by Zarthalad. Zarthalad. I hope I said that right. Zarthalad. Chinwart said his name ought to be Hugh Janus. Hugh Janus. Hugh Janus. Okay. Backpacker Tom said it ought to be Yamat. That's Tommy spelled backwards. Helion 40 said it ought to be Little Lebowski. Little Lebowski, I'm sorry. I got my sunnies on and not my grandpa glasses. Hard to read. See, Dracklam's my buddy Sean. He wrote in and said his name ought to be Tommy in 10 years. probably so in 10 years. John Boy 7856 wrote in and said his name ought to be Hugh G. Rection. Hugh Rection. Okay, Hugh G. Rection. Oh. Dildo Merchant. What the hell y'all come up with these names? Dildo Merchant wrote in and said his name ought to be Frog Sack. Oh. Osgood 1X said his name ought to be Herman Hashbrown. My buddy Dibber. Dibber's page. If y'all don't know Dibber, go see him. Little plug there for you, boy. Dibber's page wrote in and said his name ought to be Al Liquor Twite. Liquor Twite. That's what he said. I'm just reading the paper, folks. HYS only. That's my good friend daughter. She said his name ought to be Elmer. Firefighter Meath said his name ought to be Nora Batty. Nora Batty, okay. Spectrum 33 says his name ought to be Ivor Biggin. CJ Daddy 43 wrote in and said his name ought to be Grandpa Thomas. Now that's one page. Diana's Me says his name ought to be Herbie Rosencrotch. And Smiler Tyler 1, he gave 3 suggestions. Poker Pain, Cracker Dorn, and E-Nose. And he's got explanations. Y'all go down in the info and read why. And let's see, E. Rogers 36 said that it ought to be You Been Done Right. You Been Done Right. Glassay said his name ought to be Mike Hunt. Thought I was going to say that fast, didn't you? Let's see, Todd Pounds, he says his name ought to be Lester Ray Davenport. I kind of like that. Rich Munich from Chicago, I'm just picking on you, said his name ought to be Woody Doodat. The Mo Whiskey said his name ought to be Urkel. Big Easy says Jumpin' Jack Flash. And STGT Home Tar says his name ought to be Uncle George. Tucker's Own says his name ought to be Higher Panners. And let's see. RZ Jokers 1000 says his name ought to be Oldie McDuty. Kind of like that, McDuty. Good Irish name. I'm half Irish, so don't get upset, you Irish people out there. Let's see. Oh, Dark X64 says Herpius McDurpius. Okay. The Naked Wombat says his name ought to be Sir Gropar. Okay. And we got a long one here. Catfellow. Follow me on this one. Catfellow says his name ought to be Mr. Richard Robert Roy Brown Esquire Jr. the Third. Ricky Rob for short. Proof is in the pudding. They said his name ought to be Frank Focknot. Frank Focknot. Thor Thompson said his name needs to be Otis T. Winkleberg. And here's another one of those weird channel names. C1H9R9E5GIE says the name ought to be Uncle Frederick. Okay. And NO2647 says you ought to just call him Bill. dDayye Wanda, my buddy dDayye, he says his name needs to be Jerry Tall, JT for short. And then Stigma Buster 22, he says his name just ought to be plain old simple Out Lester. So y'all just take this and look down there and vote for the best name you think possible. The people that suggested names, get your friends and subscribers, come over and vote for the name that you want, and we'll have a good time. And we'll see y'all later. Oh, I stepped on some cornflakes this morning. Does that make me a serial killer? Talk to y'all later. Have a good day.